Good morning and welcome to Facilitating Safe and Healthy Interdog Play in Shelters. I'm Velez and I'm the Executive Director for the Shelter Playgroup Alliance. Before you start learning from anybody, I think it's important for you to know what their biases are. You can often get a hint to what those are through looking at where they studied, where they decided to go to school, who they decided to learn from, and in what disciplines they decided to study. So my background is in psychology. I also have the dubious distinction of having all but dissertation for a doctorate in international multicultural education, and you can see a list of the animal behavior and training programs that I've completed. These are the major ones. Of course, I've done a ton of continuing education as well. So let's get started. Before we talk about interdog play, I want to give you a context for how interdog play fits into the shelter environment. And that is generally through an enrichment program. So we're going to look at what enrichment is and isn't. Technically, enrichment is an animal husbandry principle that seeks to enhance the quality of life of our captive animals. And when we have our companion animals in shelter, I think that we can pretty well call them captive. The purpose of enrichment is to enhance the well-being of that animal, both physically and emotionally. So while enjoyment and positive reinforcement isn't necessarily a requirement for meeting an animal's enrichment needs, I would argue that in the shelter environment, that creating positive experiences for the animals in our care when we are delivering enrichment is an important component. Another important aspect for enrichment in the shelter environment is enhancing the in-kennel enrichment opportunities for our sheltered animals. They spend a lot of time in their kennel. So delivering positive enrichment activities in the context of their kennel can decrease their stress, and it also can have the added benefit of making kennel returns much easier. So when we consider creating an enrichment program, one of the first things that we begin to do is look at what are species typical behaviors for that particular species in which we're targeting for enrichment. In this case, let's just take canines. So what are some of the species typical behaviors that canines do? Well, they dig, they can chew, they scent, they predate. Engaging with their conspecifics through interdog interactions. They can solve problems. Oftentimes we present them with training problems and also human interaction. So just basic touching the animal or training can be a combination of problem solving and human interaction. Now, this is not a comprehensive list of all of the canine species typical behaviors. This is a subset of species typical behaviors for our companion animals that we can easily target for enrichment activities. So what are the types of enrichment activities that we can create, particularly in the shelter? So I'll put some context around each of the things that you see here. So for types of enrichment that is feeding based, we can provide certain animals with different ways of delivering food. In a large open emission shelter, this may be only a small subset of animals that we hold out for different types of feeding, either through a Kong or through puzzle feeders. In other, maybe smaller shelters where you can deliver different feeding for each and every one of your animals, that is something to consider as well. The provision of novel objects for the animals to be able to have a different tactile experience. So in some cases that might be providing an enrichment yard where there is different substrate, where there's an opportunity for the animal to walk on pebbles, as well as redwood chips, as well as grass, as well as cement. Sometimes this is just encouraging your volunteers to take different paths every day where the animal has an opportunity to experience different things beneath their feet. They have an experience of different objects in which to investigate. The structural type of enrichment in a zoo, we might see that there is significant alteration of the physical space of the enclosure. This is a little bit more difficult to do with our dogs who are in kennels in a shelter. We're not necessarily going to do a kennel rotation once a week, but what that does mean is being very careful about not bringing the animal to the same yard each day in order to get their enrichment. That being thoughtful about asking volunteers or staff who are walking the animals to take them to different places. We can also add additional sounds through a dog's ear is a very popular type of artificial sound. Audio books. You can have sounds of nature piped into the shelter. One of the important things to consider for enrichment is variability as well. So not through a dog's ear every single day, but through a dog's ear in a rotation with other types of auditory stimuli. The addition of natural or artificial odors is also important. We know that our canines experience much of the world through their sense of scent or sense of smell. So adding things that are different for those animals, so that can include very diluted essential oils, novel smells, or taking the animals to different places where they can experience different olfactory. So from this list of enrichment, then we would create an enrichment plan. Part of what I would encourage you to do is to consider having a variety of enrichment activities in addition to considering how to add interdog play as part of a larger enrichment strategy is to create an enrichment yard. And I'm going to play a video and you'll get to see what an enrichment yard looks like. So some of the things that I want you to look at in this video are the variety of items and also how the handler guides the animal through that enrichment yard and allows them within some constraints to choose their activity. In this next section, we'll examine interdog interactions. We'll look at what good looks like and what not so good looks like. Before we take a look at interdog interactions and what good looks like and what not so good look like, let's take a step back and look at the function of communication. There are three main categories for most of the communication signals that canines use. Distance decreasing, I'd like you to come here, I'd like to interact with you. Distance increasing, I would like for you to go away. And the expression of emotion. So that can be the expression of what we would call joy or fear. So those are generally constellations of communication signals that are intended to express the emotion. So let's take a look at a brief video. In that video, identify which category or categories the behavior falls in. think we can safely say that Ivy, the little chihuahua that you see bounding through the grass, was experiencing joy. Another concept that I'd like to explore is that of appetitive and aversive stimuli. Appetitive stimuli are things that the animal enjoys. Aversive stimuli are things that the animal will seek to avoid. So as we're looking at interdog interactions, I'd like you to conceptualize another dog as either being appetitive or aversive in the context of that interaction. So as we think about both appetitive and aversive stimuli, thinking about all of the stimuli on a continuum to being highly aversive, moderately aversive, somewhat aversive. And then as we're going along that continuum, we might find somewhat of a midpoint where the animal is in conflict. They may feel both ways about the stimuli. In a certain dose or in certain context, that stimuli is aversive, and in certain other contexts, that stimuli is appetitive. So we can't generally classify something as appetitive or aversive all of the time, but when we're examining interdog interactions, if we look in that moment and classify that other animal as being either appetitive or aversive, then we can make decisions that preserve the experience of that animal, which, as I mentioned earlier, when we're thinking about interdog play as a component of a larger enrichment program, it is really important for those experiences to be generally appetitive. So what are some of the features of healthy play? Healthy, and I put this in quotes because it's a construct. So what healthy play would look like is that both of the dogs have relaxed muscles, their spines are curved, the muscles on their faces are relaxed, their ears are relaxed and back, the muscles around their eyes are relaxed, generally giving us that sort of almond eye look. Their movements are fluid, they take frequent breaks, and there are regular changes in activity, that we don't see the exact same activity being repeated over and over and over again. In order to illustrate that, we'll take a look at another video. As you're watching the video, look at the musculature of the animals. Also, classify for yourself whether that the two dogs perceive each other as appetitive stimuli. And generally you can measure that by, does that dog go and approach that other dog in a loose way where their muscles are relaxed, their spine is curved, their face is relaxed, the movements are fluid, and do you see breaks in that play? The interactions that you just watched very likely made you feel happy seeing the dogs enjoying their times together. Hopefully you were able to see a number of the canine social behaviors that we associate with good play. So loose bodies, curved spines, relaxed faces, particularly with the two pit bull type dogs that were laying on the ground and wrestling. Their bodies are quintessentially just loose. Contrast, inappropriate or unhealthy interactions feature tense bodies, straight spines. The facial muscles are very tense. As you can see in the picture, the muscles around the eyes are tense, making the eyes wide. The ears are tense and forward. There are generally slow and deliberate movements. There isn't often break taking, particularly in what would be considered a high arousal interaction where the dogs are negotiating as opposed to playing. There is also active avoidance or active threat behavior. In the next video, you'll see a number of interactions that are inappropriate and where you see that the dogs are not viewing each other as appetitive stimuli, where in fact one of the other dogs or both of the dogs are seeing each other as aversive. So as you look at that video, look for the amount of body tension, look for the spinal curvature or lack thereof. Look at the faces and see how tense the faces are. Look at the movement of the dogs. Are they slow and deliberate in contrast to loose? So these examples that you just watched of not play, of unhealthy interdog interactions, were good examples of dogs who are seeing one or more of the other dogs as aversive stimuli. So we saw a lot of avoidance. What you probably also recognized in a couple of the videos is that several of the dogs were seeking help from the humans who were in the yard. So you saw the black dog, the little black dog that you saw at the very beginning, at certain points in the video going up to the humans and essentially asking for assistance. You also saw the brown and white hound type dog go and seek assistance from a human handler, very likely to ask to exit the play yard. Now that you have a sense of what good looks like in terms of play, let's look at the equipment that we can use in order to facilitate play being healthy. One of the recommended tools is a treat pouch with plenty of food. I used to be really worried about interdog resource guarding, but what I've found over the years is that that is much less of a worry. Now, if you have a severe interdog resource guarder at your shelter that you want to have in playgroup, then of course discard the treat pouch and food. But by and large, this is a really great tool for reinforcing the dog when they come away from play, because we're going to be talking about how to teach the dogs to take frequent breaks. The next tool is a harness and leash. Now, if you work at an open admission shelter, you probably move your dogs through the facility on a slip lead. So in that case, you may want to consider buying a set of harnesses, maybe 5 to 10 harnesses in different sizes that you will use for play. So in that case, you would introduce the dogs on the slip lead, and then if the dogs both consent, they both indicate that they would like to interact with each other, then change into the harness and then continue on with the greet and management of play. The next tool is a squeaky toy. So the way that we use the squeaky toy is we condition it as a cue for orient to handler. So you begin by pairing the squeak with treats, just like you would load a clicker, but it is intended to be a cue as opposed to a marker. So when you're walking the dog from the kennel to the play yard, introduce the squeaky. So when you squeak, then you generally get an orientation response. The dog orients to you, deliver a treat. So you can repeat that a number of times before you get to the play yard in order to establish the relationship between the squeak and a treat. As the dog becomes more savvy to the meaning of the squeak as a cue for orient to handler, then you'll see a pretty solid response. In most instances, seen the squeaky toy operate as a cue for orient to handler very quickly. A couple of things about the squeaky toy is make sure that it stays on your person. We don't want it to become an actual toy. It really is intended to be a neutral tone that any handler can use in order to have it established as a regular cue that is consistent and has one single meaning. The 3 items that I just covered, the treat pouch with food, the harness and leash, and the squeaky toy, are generally the tools that you use most often in order to manage play. But those tools are for when everything is going well. So what if something isn't going well? The use of a pigboard or similar can interrupt a hard stare or get in between dogs so that handlers can go and grab their dogs and remove them from the yard. So having a pigboard in each yard is a good conflict reduction tool. The next level of tool is the use of a hose or a bucket of water. Now, this is to be used only if there is an actual fight or a latch on, using the hose or the bucket of water to interrupt the behavior and then safely remove the animals from the yard. So now I included the use of a loud noise because I get a lot of questions about the use of noise to interrupt behavior. While it can be a useful tool, I actually find it to be less effective than the use of a pigboard. Avoiding the use of a loud noise avoids potentially scaring or startling other dogs who are not involved in a conflict. So I include this in order to illustrate all of these tools on a scale from least to most intrusive. So the most intrusive and most aversive is the use of a loud noise as an interrupter. In this next section, we will explore conducting dog-dog introductions. So we will take a risk-averse approach, and generally what I recommend is having only some level of risk tolerance, particularly in a shelter environment where the dogs are very close to thresholds because of potential trigger stacking. They're often quite stressed in the shelter setting. And so I prefer in the shelter environment to take a risk-averse approach. So what that means is that I always start greets in protected contact when possible. So protected contact means that the dogs meet through a fence. If that's not available, then we can start the greet in semi-protected contact where the dogs meet with their leashes on and attached to a handler. Quite often I see that the first time the dogs meet, they're really not interested in play. And if we keep the greet short and positive and really carefully look at the dog's interest level in each other, quite often, even if the dog says no the first time that they greet, quite often that turns into a yes the next day or the next time that the dogs meet. So I am not one to push dogs to greet each other too quickly. I prefer to take time to make sure that the dogs are really truly interested in each other, as opposed to putting them into a yard and dropping leashes right away. So now we'll look at a couple of videos of some protected contact greets. During this protected contact greet, you can see that both animals are loose. They're both interested in each other. The small dog on the left is a little concerned about the greet. You see that her tail is wagging low and she ends up walking away. This is an interaction that I would move to the next step of having the dogs greet again in semi-protected contact. In this next interaction with the shepherd and the striped dog, we see that the greet is a little bit more tense. The shepherd lingers at the fence for a longer period of time. And we see the impact of that on the white dog. He decides to not continue. So we get all of the information that we need from the striped dog about his interest in the shepherd, and he's actively avoiding. In this instance, I would not have the dogs greet again in semi-protected contact. We just call it there. Notice that the handlers have 2 hands on the leash, are allowing the dogs to approach each other, and are following the dogs, keeping their bodies parallel to the dogs in order to be able to smoothly walk them away. Notice that the handler closest to you with the dark dog is not dragging the dog to the other dog, but following them. And we notice that in this greet that the brown dog is a little less confident. His tail is wagging low. And when the white dog puts his paw over the dark dog's tail goes down and he walks away. In this next interaction, we start with a protected contact greet. You notice that both of the handlers are also have their both hands on the leash, and both of these dogs' bodies are very loose. They're wiggly, very interested in meeting each other. So then the next step is to have a semi-protected contact greet. This is the beginning of the semi-protected contact greet. Both of the handlers are testing the dog's arousal level, making sure that they're not excessively aroused. They're both able to take food. They both greet and then are able to be gently guided away from the other dog. That's our criteria for continuing to move forward. is that the dog's arousal levels are not so excessive that they can't be coaxed out of play without any major interventions. So you see that both of the handlers are pausing to have the dog orient to the handler. They're both using their squeakers and then feeding. So here we have a brief leashed greet in order to make sure that it's a positive interaction for both of the dogs. A arousal greet like this is kept very brief, and then the dogs are fed away from the other dog, and then when they're ready, both of the dogs come together again in order to greet. Clearly both of these dogs are still seeing each other as appetitive stimuli. They're both very interested in meeting again, but we're taking it as slow as possible, because if we take it slow and make sure that the dogs can calmly greet each other, then we're setting them up for success when they go out to their adoptive home. So you notice that each of these interactions are about 2 to 3 seconds, and then we're encouraging some distance from each of the dogs. Once we have the introductions out of the way and the dogs have indicated that they would like to continue interacting with each other, then we'll get into managing dog play. So we're going to take a look at a risk-averse approach. As I mentioned earlier, I prefer to take a risk-averse approach in the shelter environment, particularly because of the conditions of the shelter, and that we want to protect that dog's experiences so that when they're adopted, that they begin to see or continue to see other dogs as appetitive stimuli. So one of the first considerations when we're managing interdog play is avoiding flooding. So flooding is the phenomena where a animal, human or dog or cat, is presented with an aversive stimulus at full strength. So that creates feelings of fear and anxiety. So that's part of the reason why we're very careful about introducing dogs, labeling the other dogs as either appetitive or aversive stimuli, so that when we have that labeling structure in our mind, that and we decide that another dog is an aversive stimuli, that we're very careful that we're avoiding flooding during an enrichment activity. A related concept is developing confidence through choice. So providing animals choice about the activities that are enriching for them is a cornerstone of excellent animal care. So animals who are given the choice to opt in or opt out of an interdog interaction and then opt into a preferred enrichment activity is an important piece of helping our shelter dogs thrive behaviorally. One of the other concepts that you already saw in play in the introduction video was managing arousal. So one of the pieces that is really important for us to consider is having moderate levels of arousal during play. You've probably heard the phrase arousal tipping, that high arousal can tip to aggression. So it also creates a lot of stress on the animal. So thinking about the long-term health of those animals, we want them to have both high arousal and low arousal activities for enrichment, and not have them experience excessive levels of arousal for sustained periods of time. One of the related concepts to arousal is the circumplex model of arousal that was conceptualized in humans but has been adapted, or we have adapted it for canines. So here you see that high level of arousal when we look at that positive valence that quadrant of excitement, anticipation, fun. When the level of arousal gets excessively high, then we can tip it to frustration or anxiety, and then it changes that interaction from positive valence to negative valence. So the sweet spot is a midpoint in that high positive area where we have excitement, anticipation, and fun. And so if we provide the opportunity for dogs to take a lot of breaks by using the squeaker to call the dogs away when they're experiencing higher levels of arousal, or we start to see the respiration rate increase, we start to see the blink rate increase, we start to see the dogs engaging in repetitive type of play, the same thing over and over again, that's usually a good indication that the arousal levels are getting high. Then we can reinforce a break by squeaking the squeak toy that we've already established as a cue to orient to the handler, deliver food, and then look for the blink rate, for the pupil dilation, and the respiration all to decrease as an indication that the dogs are now ready to go back to play session. So all of these components lead up to minimizing risk through management. So we already talked about a couple of management strategies of giving the dogs breaks, paying attention to consent, minimizing flooding. The additional item is to limit the number of dogs in each playgroup. So recommend a 2-to-1 ratio of 2 dogs to handlers. So 2 dogs to 1 handler means that you can call 2 dogs away and reinforce as long as you have 2 hands that you can deliver the reinforcement or the food to the dogs with their mouths far away from each other. So that limit of 2 dogs to 1 handler also means that any one person is really paying attention to 2 dogs, and we can really watch for either signs of flooding, escape avoidance, so that the dogs maintain positive associations. The concepts that playgroups are not everything is something that I had mentioned at the beginning, that playgroups are one prong of a multi-pronged enrichment strategy or multi-pronged enrichment program. So when there are many dogs, particularly dogs who have just entered the shelter or may not have good experiences with other dogs or have limited experiences with other dogs, we often find that there aren't that many dogs who actually want to play with other dogs right off the bat. That through the process of very careful introductions and paying attention to when the dogs are not consenting to the interaction at the moment, that they're saying, no, thank you, I'd rather not meet that dog. We find that the dogs who initially say no often say yes later on to playgroups, but paying attention to that and building trust with the handlers, and then also providing positive reinforcement in the presence of the other dogs is a real key to having a healthy enrichment program in your shelter. So for the remainder of this presentation, we'll break down some examples and look at the process from start to finish. Both of these dogs are meeting each other for the first time. The squeakers have been previously introduced to both of these dogs. So they're going to greet at the fence, and we see that their body language indicates that they are indeed interested in meeting each other. The light colored dog has a nice wide sweep of his tail. He's interested in the other dog, but isn't hyper focused. The other dog is sniffing something off to the side, but also really interested in the people, and is loose. The handler dropped the leash at that point in order to avoid giving inadvertent correction to the dog. So she picks up the leash again so that the other handler can enter the play yard. When the other handler enters the play yard, we're looking for the dogs to continue to want to greet. It's actually really interesting that oftentimes in a protected contact greet, the dogs seem to be really interested in each other, but then when they have the opportunity for closer contact through a semi-protected contact greet, it actually turns out that they're not interested. And then you see a shift from interest with the other dog to active avoidance. But in this case, we see that the two dogs are still quite interested in greeting. You see that the handler has both of her hands on the leash. She's ready to very gently guide the dogs away. We're looking for the first opportunity to drop leashes and then pick up leashes whenever we need to enforce a break. In this case, the leashes got dropped very quickly, which is nice. Both of the handlers as you probably saw, that both of the dogs were really interested in each other. Their body language was still nice and loose. We did see that the light colored dog had put a paw over the one dog. He slammed into the fence, and then that was an opportunity for a break to occur. So both of the handlers are looking for their dogs to get a little bit relaxed and then see if they're interested. Again, when the dogs re-engage, then the handlers are dropping the leashes. So when the dogs are coming back to the handler and getting reinforced with food, the leashes get picked up, and then we're looking for the dogs to consent to playing with each other again. I often get a question about what if the dog is hyper-focused on food. And it turns out, in my experience at least, that if the dogs are really interested in playing with the other dog, that the food will not distract them from that interaction. That they will, if that is indeed their preference, then they will prefer play to training for food. That if the dog does begin to become hyper-focused on food or training, that we should probably look at that as a form of active avoidance. But in this case, there's really a nice balance of the dogs going back to their handler, receiving treat. You can't hear it because I've turned off the sound, but the handlers are using the squeaker in order to enforce a break. And then we see, because that pattern of engage, disengage, engage, disengage, that the dogs have now established that pattern between themselves and are taking really nice breaks so that the play remains at that quadrant that we talked about, a positive balance and moderate level of arousal. So these dogs are deciding to re-engage with each other, and the two handlers are just carefully watching the interaction and making sure that everything goes well. We also encourage the handlers to interact with the dogs, that if the dog is interested in saying hello to the person, saying hello back to them. I often get also asked if you're supposed to only pay attention to like one assigned dog. And I would say that you should pay attention to the dogs and whichever dog is in front of you. but not have a real strict assignment of which dog you're going to reinforce. If you squeak and a dog that you hadn't previously interacted with comes to you for reinforcement, then deliver that reinforcement. Look for, if it's necessary, look for their respiration rate to come down and blink rate to come down, and their pupils to go back to some form of not quite as dilated, so that we're looking for those indications that the arousal levels are in that moderate category, so that we don't have playing tipping over to aggression or frustration or anxiety. And so we see with these two dogs, because those greets have been really carefully done, their play is being managed with breaks, that they are engaging in some really nice play. So they're doing different things. They're deciding to lay in proximity to each other. They're running a little bit. They've done some ground wrestling. So that variety of play behaviors is a really good indication that the play is going well, that they're not getting stuck in a high arousal loop where we see a behavior repeating over and over and over again. So this is a really lovely example of play going well. So because the play has gone so well, both of the handlers have decided to remove leashes. So we don't always see that in a first interaction that we remove leashes. Usually in a second or third interaction with the dogs do we remove leashes, because that means that we're really relying on the squeaker to call the dogs back to us, that we don't have the leash dragging as a backup. But this particular interaction is really lovely between these two dogs, and so we look for the first signs that we can take the next step. So ultimately, this is what we'd want to see, that the dogs are in the harnesses, there is no leash dragging, and they readily come back to the handler when the squeaker is squeaked and gain reinforcement, and then are able to go back to play. And developing that skill of going back to a human, being able to come out of play, is a really good life skill for our dogs in our shelters, because inevitably our dogs are going to get hopefully our dogs will get adopted. Perhaps it's not inevitable, but quite often, despite us maybe saying don't take the dog to a dog park, very often our dogs will end up being taken to a dog park. So with that in mind, if we can install some really nice behaviors, a behavioral repertoire of being able to be called away from play in our shelter dogs, then we're setting them up for success in the home and minimal frustration for our adopters, at least in this particular setting. So this is a really nice life skill for the dogs to develop for when they eventually get adopted. Here's an example of two young dogs who are meeting. I think they're about 3 and 4 months old. So in this particular context, we weren't able to do a protected contact greet because of the facility and the age of the dogs. So we're starting off with a semi-protected contact greet. We see that the first time that the brown puppy greets the slightly larger dog, he's a little overwhelmed and moves away. The handler allows him to move away. And then we see that he's a little bit more interested as he discovered that he can go toward the larger puppy and then away from that puppy. So we're helping him develop some confidence. We find with puppies that that quite often they'll start off and they'll be a little worried, but they'll recover quite quickly, and then be interested in engaging with that larger dog. So with a larger dog and a smaller dog, even though they're both quite young, we'll want to sort of handicap that larger dog a little bit when we're managing the play. So you see that the handler of the lighter color dog has dropped the leash and allowed the smaller dog to go back and forth on his own, and that the handler with the darker dog, the larger dog, is making sure that that small dog's experience still remains positive by handicapping that dog, because quite often dogs of this age don't know how to self-handicap quite so well, and we don't want the smaller dog to have any bad experiences, particularly given the age. So we want them to still have fun, and keeping the larger dog on leash, we're certainly seeing that he is enjoying his time. He's not able to fully engage, but he's still really interested in playing with that other dog. We see his body remaining loose. We're not seeing any signs of frustration. So we're able to reinforce him, and he's still taking food. He orients to the handler, and is not barking or whining, and indicating that he is feeling frustrated by being restrained by the leash. So we're protecting the experience of the younger dog while also allowing the older puppy to have an enjoyable time. Quite often ideally, we would be matching dogs of the same age and same size, but in the shelter setting, we don't often have that luxury of having dogs who are the exact same age or the same size or have the same abilities. So that means that we can get creative with leash handling and paying attention to the other things that we have at our disposal. And in this case, the younger puppy got a little over aroused, so we're switching to a mat activity. I think colloquially we call it a relax on a mat, but we're probably just going to get a hang out on the mat as opposed to a true relaxation, which is actually quite difficult to achieve. So we start by providing treats on the mat. So having this variety of activities for the dogs to engage in, where it's not just 100% focused on play, that they're able to move away from the other dog, engage in another activity, and then go back to play when both dogs are more relaxed and able to engage in the play session without getting over aroused. As we're wrapping up, I just want to leave you with some resources. So the first two are from our organization, the Shelter Playgroup Alliance. We have a YouTube channel that has videos of what good play looks like. Also has some subtitles that describe the play behaviors if you want to refresh or share with either your staff or volunteers. Our website also has our guidelines, so it is a written documentation of the step-by-step of how to manage play, some of the considerations. Also talks about documenting play, which we didn't discuss today, but documenting the results of every interaction from the dog in your shelter software. There are a couple of other resources from both Barbara Handelman and Brenda Aloff on canine behavior. So if some of the more in-depth canine behaviors are newer to you, or you want a reference for your staff or volunteers, both of these books provide some really nice overviews of canine behavior. And then if you want to look more specifically at play, the Canine Play Behavior, The Science of Dogs at Play by Kaufer is a really nice book that gives some details on some of the science and some of the research on interdog play. So thank you for spending this hour with me. And if you have any questions about our approach to play, you can certainly email me at Mara, that's MARA, at shelterdogplay.org.